So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And we are now proceeding with the fireside conversation between the EU Vice President, Maroš Šefčovič, and the US Energy Secretary Moniz. And this discussion will be around how the EU and the US are working together to achieve the 2 degrees objective. We are happy to have secured Amy Harder, who is the energy reporter of Wall Street Journal. And Amy, before she joined the Wall Street Journal, Washington Bureau, she covered energy at the National Journal. And she is famous for her coverage of the national legislation, congressional affairs, executive branch rulemakings, and also the international policy around energy policies. So, please.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank Secretary Moniz and Vice President Šefčovič for being with us today. Both of you have such a wealth of experience on this area of clean energy and climate change that if you talk for too long, I will interrupt you. So this is your warning. And I want to dive right into the questions. First, Secretary Moniz, I want to start with you. You very recently returned from a meeting with the energy ministers from the member nations of the G7, 7 major Western countries. What would you say is the biggest takeaway from that meeting? Was it Paris climate related? Was it conflict focused, cheap oil prices, or something else?
Well, first of all, Amy, let me say very recently means yesterday evening, returning from Japan. And the meeting was the G7 energy ministers, plus the EU and IRENA and the IEA, excuse me. The meeting, I would say, on the one hand, extended the energy security theme that the G7 energy ministers really focused on starting in 2014, following the Ukraine events, and much broader, and Maroš can certainly can comment on the issues of European energy security, in which we are also very, very interested. But the energy security theme was extended, and in particular, one dimension of extension was a focus on collaborating on cybersecurity and energy systems. However, secondly, the energy security principles we put forward in 2014 encompassed the intersection with clean energy, efficiency as part of energy security now. So therefore, in the first meeting post COP21, clearly this became a major focus, how we would collaborate in these areas. And we are advancing a number of initiatives, including in efficiency. This is intertwined, and we'll come back to this later perhaps, with the clean energy ministerial agenda that we are setting for June 1st. So, for example, Europe, many European countries are leaders in industrial energy efficiency, implementing ISO 50001, and they and we, Canada, United States, Japan, and other countries in the Clean Energy Ministerial will be advocating that and pushing that quite aggressively as, again, EU, US, and other partners. That's just a little bit of a flavor, but I thought it was a very productive meeting in terms of setting an agenda for the next year, particularly the post-COP agenda.
Did you get a sense that there were a lot of interest in immediately complying with the Paris deal and getting that on track to being implemented?
Absolutely. No, I think all of the G7 are very committed to implementing the deal, to pursuing successfully the INDCs. But I also will add, and again, maybe something we can come back to, is that the Paris commitments, of course, typically are 10 to 15 years, depending upon the country. The Clean Energy Ministerial agenda is very much focused on deployment of the existing technologies on which we've made considerable cost reduction progress. But then there is a second agenda that we discussed quite a bit called Mission Innovation, which is really generating the additional technology advances that we're going to need for the increased ambition we will need beyond this 10 and 15 year timescale. So we're all in this quite lined up together.
VP Šefčovič, I want to ask you about some of the speech you gave in mid-April, where you discussed the various conditions ranging from technological to political that might be needed to shift significantly toward cleaner energy in Europe. I want to broaden that out a bit and then flip it. What would you say are the biggest conditions holding back the biggest emitting regions of the world from shifting to clean energy?
I think that there are such three major challenges we have to face. The first one, of course, it's technological, and I really would like to thank Secretary Moniz for the idea of mission innovation, and also including the leading industrialists and innovators like Bill Gates into this breakthrough coalition to really highlight how important the technology will be for the future. How to get, for example, the abundant energy from wind and solar across the whole country. We see how big challenge this is, for example, in Germany, how we can actually share that energy with other countries in the EU. What do we need to do in the field of interconnectors, efficient power lines, smart grids to just profit from this new sustainable and renewable energy? Second group of challenges would be what I would call financial issues, because I think until we get the carbon price right, until we restore the price signals in the European energy market, until we complete the single market for energy in Europe, so we can see that the energy would really flow freely across the EU member states. In that case, it would be, of course, very difficult to make sure that the pace and introduction of the new technologies and the wider spread of renewables will progress at the pace we need to meet our ambitious goals for 2030. And third issue, which I don't think we discuss that often, but I think it's very much on the minds of many people. This is I would call it societal challenge, especially if it comes to the cities and regions where for decades, sometimes centuries, the traditional oil industry been employing a lot of people, where you have the miners still working in the mines, and they are just personally worried what this energy transition would bring to them. And I think we have to offer them a brighter future, new skills, new business models for the cities. Therefore, the agenda upon which we are working together with Mike Bloomberg on how to transform these regions into the regions of the future, how to introduce the smart cities concept into transforming the future of the societies. All this would be very important. I think these would be such a three key challenges we have to face to make sure that this transition and transformation to the new 21st big data economy will really take place.
So you mentioned...
Amy, may I just interject?
Of course you can.
Since this is a chat.
Fireplace, you know?
Just to say...
we don't have the fire, but we have the chat.
But just want to say that, I certainly agree with all that Maroš said.
But feel free also to disagree.
No, I look forward to it. But at the moment, I agree with what he said. And I just wanted to say that actually, even a backdrop to what he just said is that, the energy system is one that inherently, certainly historically, takes time to move. And there are some very, very clear reasons for that. It's a system that provides essential services to everybody. So reliability is a very, very important characteristic of how you do the system. There's lots of things. Because of that, by the way, it's a highly regulated system in most countries, certainly. And just to say a third thing is, we know in many parts of the system, the capital investments for long-lived assets are just enormous. So this is only to say that these are the kind of pre-existing conditions we have to recognize. And it also means that we've already mentioned technology innovation as essential, which obviously I agree to. But we should not lose sight of the fact that policy innovation and business model innovation are going to be equally important. And it's our jobs to help make all those come together to accelerate the transition to low carbon.
A lot of the deals and a lot of the commitments in the Paris Climate Agreement go primarily to 2030. Now, I know the Obama administration has recently said that it will sometime this year. You can feel free to tell us exactly when. The administration will put out a strategy of reducing carbon emissions through 2050. Now, President Obama has said, beginning in 2009, that he has aimed to cut greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050 based on 2005 levels. Talking about this long transition that's needed and the agreements that are on the table right now with the Paris deal, do we need to be thinking longer term with technology? I mean, it seems like people generally think that if there's going to be a widespread technology available by 2050, it needs to be somehow existing today because of that long transition. So I guess a question for both of you, I mean, do you think we're doing enough for the long-term planning out to 2050? And if not, then what needs to be done from a technological and business perspective to get there? And also, of course, political. That certainly should not also be overlooked.
Okay, I'll make a few first comments. First of all, the 80%, I think is pretty much of a consensus view as what certainly the most developed nations will have to do by mid-century if we are to meet the 2-degree or lower target. So I think it's essential that we have that as a kind of our planning horizon. Now, I would argue one of the things we've already done to get there, I'm not saying this is sufficient, but it's necessary, is mission innovation. That is exactly about developing and opening up the innovation pipeline and linking it to investors that are willing to move those technologies out. And I want to emphasize, move them out not just in the early stages, like to the first precipice of Valley of Death, but the Breakthrough Energy Coalition that Maroš mentioned, the Bill Gates-led coalition, has made it clear they are prepared also to make the deep capital investments on the most promising ones to get them to scale. So I think that's critical, and I think it is an essential enabler for that ambition to reach the 80% or even greater reduction in emissions. However, we will need, as I said earlier, we will also need policy innovation. For example, in the United States, I believe that the president's climate action plan is very strong and can certainly, with existing technologies and foreseeable evolutionary improvements, can get us to our 2020 goal and our 2025 goal, which was our Paris goal.
Can it get to a 2050 goal?
I think eventually, no. So I think eventually we are going to need an economy-wide legislative approach. The president said in 2013, when he introduced the Climate Action Plan, he said that we would like to work with Congress in moving this forward, but we can't wait. And so we're moving forward with these sectoral approaches, if you like, with efficient vehicles, with clean power plant, with appliance efficiency standards, support for renewable, support for nuclear innovation and development. So we're moving across the board. I think personally, eventually, we will have to, some administration will be working with Congress on a more comprehensive legislative solution. The last thing, again, and I'll just be very brief, is the business model innovation cannot be forgotten either. In a world where, particularly where we succeed on the demand side, and I personally do not see any solution to deep decarbonization without major demand side progress. Well, demand side progress is inherently a challenge to traditional business models.
Because you're reducing the use of their product.
And so you take an electric utility, and we're seeing the beginnings of this now. What are the different service sectors in which that utility operates? Where does it operate? Where does it go in the home in terms of management of loads? How is distributed generation managed, owned, you name it? We are at the beginning of kind of sorting out how these new business models will shake out.
I'm going to come back to a couple of your points, but first I want to turn to you and ask that question to you about the long-term planning. I've talked to some people who say that planning out to 2030 inherently will not get us to 2050 goals. Is there a lot of long-term deep carbonization planning going on in Europe?
I have to say that while we've been planning and modeling what should be Europe's best contribution for Paris Agreement, and we've been setting our targets for 2030. What we did was actually our internal modeling, where we need to be in 2030, so we would hit the target of 80-90% of reduction by 2050, because that's clearly the milestone we need to reach if we want to be in carbon neutral economy by the end of the century. So this is how we did our own calculation in Europe. So I want to say that we have the plan for 2050, but at the same time, I have to say that this is very long-term planning, which need the adjustment, which need the inclusion of all these new technological breakthroughs, which are bringing the new innovations to the table. And at the same time, I think we need to have a very regular assessment how we are progressing to our climate goals. So therefore, I think that system introduced into the Paris Agreement, to have it first in 2018, UN IPCC panel to assess what does it mean, this aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees, what kind of adjustment of the goals would be needed, what kind of policy options we have. And then there is the obligation for all participants to the treaty to develop their own long roadmap up to 2050 by 2020. And then I think what is very important, and what I think we've been missing in the past a little bit, was this regular assessment. So as of 2023, we would have this global stock taking. How are we doing as a global community? Are we on the target? Are we behind? Do we have too many free riders? How we can help the countries to keep up with...
Of course, it's very hard to do when you have politicians changing.
Exactly. And then, of course, I think what needs to be done in such a long-term perspective is to send very right regulatory and political signals. And I think we made it in Paris, because it's quite clear what would be the future of the world economy, that we are now in the transition towards low carbon economy. We know what would be the technologies of the future, what are the goals, and I think this was very important signal not only for the mankind but for the business community, how to orient themselves in this situation. And now I think, as Secretary Moniz highlighted, we need to provide adequate regulatory framework, legal certainty for the businesses to do the long-term planning, because of course with the proper involvement of the private sector, with all that innovation and long-term investment, it would be very difficult to transform all that structures which have been built over the long decades, and really to change the infrastructure for this new kind of economy.
So Bill Gates has been mentioned a couple of times. He recently made news for saying that he doesn't think a carbon tax will ultimately be the consensus option for the U.S. And instead the focus should be and will be on the supply side. Now there's an ocean of difference between the economic and political realities of a carbon tax, and we can talk about that if you guys would like. But first, Secretary Moniz, I'll go to you first. Do you agree with Mr. Gates that supply-side policies, such as new funding opportunities for technology or public-private partnerships to spur transitions, will ultimately be the better and more politically palpable option for the U.S. instead of demand-side policies like a carbon tax?
Well, first of all, I want to stress I think Bill Gates would include demand-side technology advances along with supply-side technologies in his solution. Now, obviously, I agree with Bill, and you know, and we worked closely in developing the parallel coalitions of the Mission Innovation countries, the 20 countries, and the investor group, and I fully believe that innovation, again, is key to meeting these goals. But to go to this comment, the result of the innovation, sure, there will be some new services provided in the energy sector, writ broadly. One example could be the widespread use in urban areas of autonomous vehicles, electric autonomous vehicles. That's kind of a new service, potentially. Whether that is realized or not, we'll see. But the bread and butter of the energy sector is providing, let's face it, what is a commodity, electricity, mobility, heat, in increasingly inexpensive ways. And that will be the product of the innovation. The lower cost, the continuous drive to lower costs, will enable much easier policymaking, which could be a carbon tax, a carbon charge. That would be an example of a, quote, relatively straightforward economy-wide approach. Okay.
That Congress could pass.
But I think one is going to need to have in the end, again, the technology, the policy, and the business models working together, but the advance in technology will enable that policy advance to occur much more easily and I think much more comprehensively.
Do you have any comments about that? I mean, of course, Europe has a cap and trade system.
Yeah, I think that again, demand side management and carbon tax. If it comes to the demand side management, I think what it's hiding behind this, what is very important, I think it's the shift of behavior of the consumer. That's, I think, what's very important, because only active consumers, well-informed consumers will push for the more competition, for the better services on providing the energy. And I think that if with Ernest we both talk about change of business model, I think that the business model for the energy providers for the future would not be just to provide the electricity or the heat. It would be to provide new kind of services. It will have to go in the global package to provide energy efficiency, to provide high quality services, to provide clean energy, because this is what people would demand. And I think that the generation which is now graduating in our universities, they would be much more environmentally conscious. They would like to have a home automation system. They would like to make sure that their households and houses are smart and they can remotely control what's happening there. And we already see it, how these technologies are picking up. So we believe strongly in the empowerment of the consumers, and for us, the demand side management, it's a very important choice, and you will see it reflected in the proposal we are currently working on redesigning the electricity market in Europe, where we feel that we really need to give much more power to the consumers. And on the carbon tax, as you know, we have emission trading system in Europe. We hope that China will introduce its own, as they stated several times in a year or two. When I was in Quebec and Ontario and California, I saw how these provinces or states are trading with each other with the carbon credits. I learned about REGI system working here in the States. We have something similar in South Korea. So I think that also one of the conclusions of the Paris should be that we should really take also a little bit the longer term perspective, be 2030, 2050. But what I think we would need in the end would be well-functioning world carbon price setting mechanisms. And I think that we should test it. I know that our lawyers are telling me it will be legally very difficult. Our economists are telling me, you know,
to do a carbon tax?
No, to link up the systems we have, because I think that in Europe, I mean, we have a big debate with the industry already for years about carbon leakage. You know that the European industry is faced with a strong competition from the countries where, let's say, the environmental laws are not so demanding, where the ETS system not introduced. So I think in the end, if you want to have this global transition to the low carbon economy, we also need to have something like we have with oil, a global pricing system for carbon, because I think that would be the first way how to promote this transition to the low carbon economy.
Maybe in 50 years we'll be talking about lower high carbon prices being traded around the world. Do you know,
Amy, just one thing that I just want to make an injection on the technology side, relevant to something Maroš said, and that is that I think we are still at the very beginnings of the integration of IT writ broadly into the whole energy system, and that's going to be quite transformative.
Do you think a carbon tax would be better than the cap and trade system in Europe?
I think with our ETS, we introduced it. It was the first system of this kind, so I think we've been very proud how technically it worked. Today we have to admit that all entry data we put into the system were not correct one, that now we are in a situation where we have to remove the 800 million allowances from the system, because simply carbon price we have in Europe around 6 euros per ton clearly doesn't reflect all the negative externalities the carbon brings to the society and to the economy. But we believe that a market should be in the best position to determine a real carbon price. But I also see that other countries have different experiences, that they introduce the floor into the carbon price. So all this, I think, will be discussed, because we presented our proposal how to reform the current ETS in Europe for post-2020 period to meet the 2030 standards. And the Member States, European Parliament start to debate it, and I'm sure that this will be also one of the issues which will be discussed around the table.
Now I have a lightning round question, which I politely ask you answer with just a yes or no. Secretary Moniz assured me that this is impossible for him, so we're all rooting for you to do this. But do you think a price on carbon is the best way to shift from fossil fuels to cleaner sources of energy?
Well, let me say.
I'll follow Ernest's approach. I think.
You guys are no fun, so you.
It's not a yes or no. I'm sorry, but look, I think any of these systems are either an explicit or an implicit price on carbon, and that's clearly what we need that through some policy mechanism, and the tax is just one of many ways. I think the real issue, and I'm sorry for the long answer, Amy, because I think the real issue is explicitly or implicitly there's a price, which means one way or another there is a resource, a financial resource to be dealt with, and the question is how is that dealt with to also address distributional issues within society with reasonable economic efficiency.
I would be a bit shorter because I would say yes to the fair carbon price, because without restoring the price signals for carbon, it's very difficult for many of the innovations to really make it to the forefront of our energy systems.
And I also want to remind you in the audience that I will be taking questions in a few minutes, so please be thinking of questions you want to ask us up here. But a couple more questions from me. So as I'm sure both of you know, Germany's carbon emissions went up after the country began to phase out its nuclear plants in the aftermath of the 2011 Fukushima disaster. I want to ask both of you, what do you think this says about the role of nuclear power and where it should play in the transition to cleaner sources of energy?
Yes.
See, let's all give him a round of applause. But there's a lot of economic headwinds facing that sector and political headwinds. Some people think the administration is not doing enough.
Obviously, Germany's made the choice of phasing out nuclear power, which I fully expected to carry through on, and which is a reflection of what I've always emphasized. There's no one zero or low carbon solution. There are going to be multiple solutions that look very different in different countries, and they're going to look very different within regions of our country. For example, on nuclear in the United States, there are 5 nuclear plants being built. They're all in the southeast, and it's because of the match to the regulatory structure in that region. So we've said, the president has said that we think nuclear has to be on the table as one of the options, and that can include facilitating the kinds of enormous capital investments that are required for new nuclear power plants of today's design. That's what's being built right now in our southeast and, of course, other parts of the world, China most especially. But also, we are also investing in innovation like small modular reactors, which, putting aside their possible technological advantages in terms of some safety systems, et cetera, may change the nature of the financial engineering you need to do nuclear. So I think there's still a lot of work to do here, and I think we will see certainly in some regions we will see significant nuclear contributions.
For me, the answer would be yes, but because we are from Europe, and here in Europe, every member state has a right to choose how they want to produce the energy, and we have half of our member states which have plans to continue to develop the nuclear sector, and we have several member states which have decided to abandon this technology and to focus more on the renewables. I agree with Ernest. What I think we need in this debate is also to have a very honest assessment about the investment needs. So we just presented our reports a couple of weeks ago. It's called PINK. It's not the name of the popular singer of the States. It's a French abbreviation which summarizes the Commission's estimate of the needed investment for the future. And we are talking about really huge investment, because for the first time what we did, we monitored the whole cycle, the fuel cycle, the front cycle, the production cycle, then end cycle, and cost for the commissioning. And therefore, I think we just need to have this full picture when the next decision would be taken. And I follow very closely the development of these innovative solutions of the smaller reactors, which would not be so financially demanding. And there, of course, the challenge would be how to make sure that even if a smaller installation, that the high standards for security and safety would be respected, because this is something that is very important for the public, for the communities where these power plants are located.
So almost all the economic modeling that I've looked at require technology known as negative emissions, meaning it can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere after it's been emitted, require that technology to be widely available in order to prevent a 2-degree rise in temperature. Bill Gates is counted as one of the funders of this type of technology. Do you think the collective climate and clean energy community needs to focus more on this type of technology that right now isn't getting much attention?
I think for quite a few European member states, the breakthrough in the carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and use technologies would be absolutely necessary, because they see the coal as a natural wealth. They see it as a energy security source, and it's quite clear that it's not only in Europe but also in a global framework that we need breakthroughs in these technologies. I have seen some slides of this CO2 capturing technology. On the slides, it looked fantastically. If this would work, we just get the CO2 from the air, we put it into the soda. I think that would be, of course, the...
You're going to get Pepsi and Coke on board, hopefully.
But I know that we still need to progress more on that, and we are going also to devote quite substantial financial support for the research in this area, because I believe that we need to get breakthrough in these technologies.
Let me say that as we moved in mission innovation, for example, with our doubling of the R&D portfolio, I think certainly more weighting on these carbon reduction techniques is warranted, and we are doing that. But let me say there are a whole variety, there's a whole spectrum. Certainly carbon capture and sequestration from electricity and industrial plants, by the way. We shouldn't, I'm sorry from the side, but we usually focus on CCS for power plants, coal plants, and eventually natural gas plants. But we should also remember that it may be the only option in many cases for major industrial plants and sources. So we are working a lot on that, and in next year's budget, we will start a set of innovative new technologies, not simple combustion, but oxy-combustion, chemical looping. We can go through various technologies. However, I want to emphasize that it's much broader. First of all, a number of pieces of work around biomass is about enhanced CO2, fixation, etc. How you manage that biomass over time is quite important. Another example, and this is going into maybe in a direction of increasing technological challenge, is the widespread use of carbon dioxide. Today, the utilization of captured carbon dioxide is almost exclusively for enhanced oil recovery, but something that does not violate the laws of physics. We are doing it. But
it's hard to do it when oil is priced at $40.
Yeah. Although we are producing 360,000 barrels a day of oil from CO2 flooding of fields. Most of that is natural CO2. But I was going to say is the conversion of sunlight plus CO2 in water into a drop-in liquid fuel, that's being worked on. It can be done. Long way from getting it done at kind of industrial scale in a process. That's kind of a holy grail if we can get there. That's something Bill Gates, for example, is very, very interested in. And then, of course, there's the idea of taking CO2 kind of out of the air in distributed ways. Again, that can be done. It's being done. The cost per ton of CO2 is extremely high, and thermodynamics suggests it will never be low on the numbers that we're talking about today. But I think the real point here is too often people talk about this as one or the other. It's not. It's all the above. And in particular, if, for example, through demand-side technologies, through renewables and nuclear, etc., we have reduced the CO2 emissions already to be very low, then these kinds of future technologies of removing CO2, even if high cost per unit, is not a high cost on the economy. And so they work together. And so I think it's very important to keep emphasizing it's not one or the other. We've got to do all of these things.
I do want to throw it out to the audience. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. I see the gentleman right there. And please state your name and your affiliation, please.
Yes, Alden Meyer, Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you for this conversation. I totally agree that we need to have a price on carbon, although it's not the only policy that we need to have. But before we get there, we need to take off the negative price on carbon. We are still paying people to pollute to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, as the IMF and the World Bank have documented. I know this topic is on the agenda for the G20 Leaders Summit in China in September, trying to follow up on the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh, where President Obama got a commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I'm wondering if either of you could update us on the state of play in that process. Can we expect to get agreement to finally stop paying people to pollute and having a negative price on carbon? And I also understand the U.S. and China have exchanged some documents about how they are progressing on this that are undergoing peer review by other countries in the OECD. Is there any update on how that's going and when and where those might be made public so that other countries could learn from that as a model?
Start?
Yeah, I think you will find in also Energy Union strategy, but in all our documents, that also this period of the low oil prices should be used for gradual phase out of the fossil fuel subsidies, or the subsidies with a negative environmental impact. But at the same time, we know that this is an enormous struggle, because that was a system which was built over the decades. So I think that we really need to find the solution at the G20 level. I think that if you look at the high volume of the subsidies for the fossil fuels and compare it how much we are subsidizing, for example, the renewables, we see that how incomparable these figures are. Very often you hear that support for the renewables is just too costly and too high. So we accept, I would say, this approach, because I agree with Ernest, this is not a silver bullet debate. We are also trying to introduce in other domains like transport, the applications of the polluter pays principle, because this is what we need to talk about. We need to be much more vocal, descriptive, and communicate in much better way that the pollution has a cost. Pollution has a cost on human health. Pollution has a cost on the quality of living in our cities, and pollution has a cost on economic future of our communities, on our countries. And that's, I think, what we've been not paying for until now, and therefore I think we are now facing that many challenges on the environmental aspect, and therefore I'm absolutely convinced that on the G7, G20 side, we need to find a solution how to resolve these both challenges.
You want to do the quick update on the U.S.-China?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would associate myself with Maroš's comments and add that President Obama has made it very clear that we like to see fossil fuel subsidies phased out. I would just say that, as was implied, it's clear that there's going to have to be graded approaches in different parts of the world to get there, because of the dislocation issues, the distributional issues that we discussed. But I think China, the dialogue with China and moving China and having China largely driven by their coal issues coming on board can be a game changer, just as it was, in my view, for the road to Paris.
We have time for one more very quick question over here.
Thank you. Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily publication. I noticed in the recent leaks of the Transatlantic Trade and Partnership Agreement, there was no leak on energy. Mr. Moniz, should there be a chapter in TTIP on energy, or in fact, should there be a standalone US-EU energy free trade agreement?
I will leave part of that to Maroš to answer.
Right now, that
from
they'll-
their
Very happy
side.
for the
But,
question.
look, the issue of a chapter is that's obviously for our trade representative Mike Froman and the Europeans to discuss. We provide, as usual, technical assistance, if you like, in those discussions. But much more than the structure, I think the issue is what's going to be the substance of a TTIP or other agreements. And there, look, the focus, we all know, the focus has been principally on natural gas. And the reality is, I would say that we are, we've already licensed, I'll use European units, more than 120 billion cubic meters per year to non-free trade agreement countries, or nearly 12 BCF per day in American units, and that's a lot of gas. And I think right now the market structures and the pricing structures are what are going to be much more determinative of what happens here. Clearly, in the European context, increasing their access to and diversity of sources of LNG is a big part. I'll let Maroš discuss that more if he wishes, but is a big part of their overall multi-pronged energy security strategy. But we've already had a half dozen or so ships sail. That includes to Europe, and I think it's going to be now determined mostly by commercial arrangements, given the flexibility to the industry.
On the TTIP, one general point, I hope that when debating and negotiating the TTIP, we will not lose the strategic vision and strategic importance of this agreement. What it would mean to put two biggest economies on this planet together, what kind of opportunities it will bring, what kind of positive values we can project to other economies, how we can promote fair trade, how we can promote clean technologies, how we can promote this more positive approach to develop economies. I think very often we kind of get bogged down to the details, which is of course part of the negotiations. But I would really plea not to lose this vision and that strategic importance of two biggest economies, traditional allies, working together on all the challenges which are brought by the globalization and sometimes by not the first of the trade practices we are witnessing over the last few months and the years. And if it comes to the energy, of course, we love to have energy chapter in the TTIP. I'm very thankful to Secretary Moniz and to the United States for lifting the restriction on export of the crude oil and the LNG. I think it's a game changer which would help the gas to become the global commodity. It helps us to diversify. It clearly directly increases energy security of Europe. And I think that such a close allies like Europeans and Americans are, that we should strive for having it under the umbrella of the TTIP. So I know that the negotiations on these are ongoing. We are ready to negotiate. We are very happy that we saw the first tankers from the States not only to sail towards Europe but already to arrive to the European ports. It's a very important signal how we can diversify and how we can consolidate the energy security in Europe. And we think that once we are discussing such a strategic document, that the energy should be part of it.
Well, we ran out of time, so I didn't get to ask my question about Donald Trump. I know you're both disappointed. And I'm sure all of you are as well. But I want to thank you both for taking the time to chat with me.
Thank
and
you,
I will
Amy.
turn it back over to Caroline.
We thank the panel for this fantastic, for this fantastic discussion. Secretary Moniz, Commissioner Šefčovič, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with this audience here.